The rope tightened around Helena Carver's wrists as Sheriff Donovan tied her to the post in the center of Ellsworth's dusty Main Street. And she knew this was how women disappeared in Kansas territory, when they spoke truths no one wanted to hear. It was August of 1872, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the prairie town that had become a shipping point for Texas longhorns making their way north on the cattle trails. Helena had arrived in Ellsworth 6 months earlier, a 22-year-old woman with dark auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see more than most folks were comfortable with. She had come to teach at the newly established schoolhouse, but what she had discovered in those months had made her more enemies than any young woman could survive. "You are making a mistake," Helena said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. A crowd had gathered, as crowds always did when there was spectacle to be had. "Benjamin Thatcher is poisoning the water supply to drive homesteaders off their claims. I have seen the arsenic containers in his warehouse with my own eyes." "Crazy woman," someone shouted from the crowd. "Always stirring up trouble with her wild accusations." Sheriff Donovan stepped back, his weathered face showing something that might have been regret. "Miss Carver, you have made serious allegations against one of this town's most respected businessmen without a shred of proof beyond your word. Mr. Thatcher has filed a complaint that you have been spreading lies intended to damage his reputation and business interests." "The proof is in the water," Helena insisted, her auburn hair falling loose from its pins as she struggled against the ropes. "Test the wells near the homesteads that have been abandoned. Talk to the families who have buried children after drinking from those wells. I am not crazy, I am telling you the truth." Benjamin Thatcher himself stepped forward from the crowd, a portly man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair and expensive clothes that spoke of wealth accumulated through means both legal and otherwise. "Sheriff, this woman has been nothing but trouble since she arrived. She fills the children's heads with nonsense, teaches them to question their betters, and now she spreads vicious lies about honest businessmen. Perhaps she belongs in the territorial asylum rather than teaching our youth." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Helena felt despair creeping in. The asylum was a death sentence, a place where inconvenient women disappeared and were never heard from again. She had been foolish to think anyone would believe a single schoolteacher over a man with Thatcher's influence and money. "Now hold on just a minute." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, deep and calm but carrying an authority that made people turn. A man pushed through the gathered townspeople, and Helena found herself looking at someone she had seen around Ellsworth but never spoken to. He was tall, perhaps 25 or 26 years old, with dark brown hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of weathered steel. He wore dusty trail clothes, a worn leather vest, and a single gun belt slung low on his hip. There was something about the way he moved that suggested competence and danger in equal measure. "Who the hell are you?" Thatcher demanded, his face reddening. "Name is Mason Kendrick," the cowboy said, stopping a few feet from where Helena was tied. His eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw something there that gave her hope for the first time in hours. "I just rode in with a cattle drive from Texas, planning to spend my pay and move on. But I cannot help noticing that you folks seem awful eager to punish this woman without hearing her out properly." Sheriff Donovan frowned. "This is town business, cowboy. Best if you stay out of it." "Might be town business," Mason agreed, "but I have been riding trail for 10 years now, and I have learned something in that time. The crazy ones are often right. The folks who see things others do not want to see, who speak up when it is easier to stay silent, they are the ones telling truths that need telling." "Are you calling me a liar?" Thatcher's voice rose dangerously. Mason turned those steel-gray eyes on the businessman, and his expression did not change. I am saying that I have known men like you in every town from San Antonio to Dodge City. Men who get rich while others suffer and die. Men who hide behind respectability while doing things in the dark that would get a common cowboy hanged. So yes, Mr. Thatcher, I reckon I am calling you a liar. The crowd erupted in angry shouts and shocked gasps. Thatcher's face went from red to purple. Sheriff, arrest this man for slander and disturbing the peace. But before Donovan could respond, another voice joined the conversation. I would be interested in hearing what evidence the young lady has to present. Everyone turned to see Judge Marcus Hartford stepping out of the Grand Central Hotel. Hartford was an older man with white hair and the kind of stern face that came from years of weighing evidence and rendering judgment. He had a reputation for fairness that extended throughout Kansas territory. Your Honor, Thatcher sputtered, surely you do not take this woman's raving seriously. I take all accusations of criminal activity seriously, Mr. Thatcher, Hartford replied. Miss Carver, you claim to have seen arsenic containers in Mr. Thatcher's warehouse. Helena nodded eagerly, finding her voice again. Yes, Your Honor. 3 days ago I was walking past the warehouse on North Street when I heard sounds of distress. A young boy, Tommy Henderson, had wandered inside and gotten trapped. I went in to help him, and while I was there I saw crates marked with the skull and crossbones, the symbol for poison. They were labeled as arsenic, at least 20 containers. A lie, Thatcher said flatly. I have no such thing in my warehouse. The woman is clearly disturbed. Mason spoke up again. Then you would not object to the judge taking a look inside that warehouse right now, would you? If there is nothing to hide, there is nothing to fear. Thatcher's eyes darted around the crowd, and Helena saw the calculation happening behind them. Of course not, he said finally. But this is a waste of everyone's time. I demand that this woman be punished for her slander regardless of what is or is not found. Judge Hartford gestured to the sheriff. Donovan, untie Miss Carver and let us all proceed to this warehouse. If she is telling the truth, we will know soon enough. If she is lying, then appropriate measures can be taken. The sheriff reluctantly freed Helena's wrists, and she rubbed at the rope burns while trying to steady her breathing. Mason stepped closer, his presence somehow reassuring despite the fact that they were strangers. Thank you, she whispered. Do not thank me yet, he replied quietly. If those containers are not where you say they are, we are both going to be in a world of trouble. The crowd moved like a single organism through Ellsworth streets toward the large warehouse that sat on the northern edge of town. Helena walked between Mason and Judge Hartford, acutely aware of the hostile stares from townspeople who had already judged her guilty. Thatcher walked ahead with the sheriff, his back stiff with indignation. When they reached the warehouse, Thatcher made a show of producing a key and unlocking the large doors. I keep this building secured because I store valuable goods here. As you will see, there is nothing sinister about my business operations. The doors swung open, and everyone pressed forward to peer inside. Helena's heart sank immediately. The warehouse was full of legitimate goods, farming equipment, barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of cloth, and various other supplies that a frontier town needed. But there was no sign of the crates she had seen 3 days earlier. Well, Miss Carver, Thatcher said triumphantly. Where are these mysterious poison containers you claim to have seen? Helena stepped inside, her mind racing. She knew what she had seen. The crates had been stacked against the far wall, right next to the corner where she had found Tommy Henderson crying because he could not find his way out. She walked to that exact spot, and her foot struck something that made a hollow sound. Judge Hartford, she called out. "The floor here sounds different." The judge came over and stamped his boot on the floorboards. There was indeed a hollow sound that suggested a space beneath. "Interesting. Mr. Thatcher, is there a cellar under this warehouse?" "Just a small storage area," Thatcher said quickly. "Nothing of significance." "Then you will not mind if we take a look," Mason said. He had moved to examine the floor more closely and found a seam in the boards that suggested a trapdoor. Within moments, he had located the hidden latch and pulled the door open. A ladder descended into darkness. Judge Hartford called for a lantern, and Sheriff Donovan reluctantly provided one. Mason took it and climbed down without hesitation. Helena held her breath, praying that her memory was accurate and that Thatcher had not had time to move everything. "Judge," Mason's voice echoed up from below, "you need to see this." One by one, they descended into the cellar. What they found there made even the cynical Sheriff Donovan curse in shock. The space was filled with wooden crates, each one bearing the skull and crossbones symbol and clearly labeled as containing arsenic. But that was not all. There were also detailed maps showing homestead claims, with certain properties marked in red ink. Notes in what must have been Thatcher's handwriting outlined a plan to contaminate water sources on specific claims, driving families away so their land could be purchased for pennies on the dollar. "This is not what it looks like," Thatcher said desperately, having followed them down. "Someone must have planted these here to frame me." Judge Hartford picked up one of the maps and studied it by lantern light. His expression was grim. "Mr. Thatcher, these documents appear to be in your handwriting. Furthermore, several of the properties marked here correspond exactly to homesteads that have been recently abandoned due to illness and death in the families. Sheriff Donovan, I believe you have sufficient cause to place this man under arrest." The sheriff moved forward with his handcuffs, but Thatcher was not finished yet. With surprising speed for a man of his size, he produced a small pistol from inside his coat and grabbed Helena, pulling her against him with the gun pressed to her temple. "No one moves," Thatcher snarled. "I have worked too hard to build what I have in this town. I will not lose it all because of some meddling woman who could not mind her own business." Mason's hand hovered near his gun, but he did not draw. His eyes were locked on Thatcher with an intensity that made Helena's breath catch even through her fear. "Let her go," he said quietly. "There is no way out of this for you now." "There is always a way out when you have money and connections," Thatcher replied. "I am walking out of here with Miss Carver. Anyone who tries to stop me, and I will kill her. Once I am safely away from Ellsworth, I will release her somewhere out on the prairie." "You will not make it 10 feet, Mason said. "Even if you do, you will spend the rest of your life running. Is that really what you want?" For a moment, everything hung in balance. Helena could feel Thatcher's hand shaking, could smell the fear sweat on him despite his bravado. Then everything happened at once. Judge Hartford deliberately dropped the lantern he was holding, plunging the cellar into darkness. Helena felt Thatcher's grip loosen in surprise, and she drove her elbow hard into his substantial stomach. There was a gunshot, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, but Helena was already diving to the side. When light returned a moment later from the sheriff's lantern, Mason had Thatcher pinned against the wall with one arm twisted behind his back, and the businessman's pistol in Mason's other hand. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go," Mason said calmly. Sheriff Donovan took custody of Thatcher, and Judge Hartford helped Helena to her feet. Her ears were still ringing from the gunshot, but she was unhurt. The bullet had gone wild in the darkness, embedding itself harmlessly in a wooden beam. "Miss Carver," the judge said formally, "I owe you an apology on behalf of this town. You were right to bring these allegations forward, and you should never have been treated the way you were today." Helena nodded, finding that her legs were suddenly unsteady. Mason was there immediately, his hand under her elbow providing support. "Let us get you out of this cellar," he said gently. They emerged into the afternoon sunlight to find that word had spread through Ellsworth like wildfire. The crowd that had been so hostile an hour earlier now seemed uncertain, whispering among themselves as Sheriff Donovan hauled Thatcher toward the jail. Judge Hartford addressed the gathered townspeople, explaining what had been found and praising Helena's courage in speaking the truth, despite the personal cost. But Helena barely heard any of it. She was aware only of Mason's steady presence beside her, the way his hand remained supportive without being presumptuous, the concern in those steel-gray eyes when he looked down at her. "I need to sit down," she admitted quietly. "I know just the place," Mason replied. He guided her away from the crowd to a small boarding house at the edge of town, where a kind widow named Mrs. Patterson rented rooms. The elderly woman took one look at Helena's pale face and rope-burned wrists and immediately ushered them inside, settling Helena on a comfortable sofa and bringing tea with honey. "You gave us all quite a scare, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, dabbing at Helena's wrists with a cool cloth. "When I heard they had tied you up in the street like a common criminal, I was appalled. But I am just an old woman. My voice carries no weight in this town." "Your kindness carries weight with me," Helena said, managing a smile. She looked up at Mason, who stood somewhat awkwardly near the door as if unsure whether he should stay or go. "Please, sit down. You risked yourself for a stranger today. I would like to know more about the man who did that." Mason removed his hat and took a seat in a wooden chair across from the sofa. "Not much to know. I have been riding cattle trails since I was 16 years old. My parents died of cholera when I was young, and I was raised by an uncle who worked ranches in Texas. He taught me everything about cattle, horses, and surviving in hard country. When he passed 5 years ago, I just kept doing what I knew." "That is more than not much," Helena said softly. "Why did you speak up for me? You could have simply ridden on and avoided all this trouble." Mason was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I have seen too many people stay silent when they should speak up. Too many times when the easy thing was to look away and mind my own business. But every time I did that, I felt a little less like the man I wanted to be. Today, when I saw you standing there telling your truth even though no one believed you, I thought here is someone with more courage than most men I have known. Seemed like the least I could do was stand with you." Something in Helena's chest tightened at his words. She had been alone in Ellsworth for months, fighting battles that no one wanted her to fight, speaking truths that no one wanted to hear. To have someone acknowledge that struggle, to have someone simply believe her, felt like water in a desert. Mrs. Patterson bustled around making supper, insisting that both Helena and Mason stay to eat. As the afternoon faded into evening, they talked. Helena told him about growing up in Ohio, about losing her parents to diphtheria when she was 18, about working her way through a teaching certification program, while living with an aunt who considered education for women a waste of resources. She spoke of coming to Kansas Territory with dreams of helping build something new, only to find the same corruption and greed that existed everywhere. Mason listened with an attention that made her feel truly heard. In turn, he told her about life on the cattle trails, about sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about storms that could scatter a herd across miles of prairie, about the strange brotherhood that developed among men who faced danger together day after day. "It sounds like a hard life," Helena observed. It is, Mason admitted, but it is an honest one. When you are out there with just the cattle and the land, there is no room for lies or pretense. A man is either competent or he is not, either trustworthy or he is not. I have always appreciated that clarity. Then you understand why I could not stay silent about what I saw, Helena said. The lies were poisoning this town as surely as the arsenic was poisoning those wells. Children were dying, and no one would acknowledge it because the man responsible had money and influence. Mason's eyes held hers. You are the bravest person I have met in a long time, Helena Carver. It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice sent warmth through her. You barely know me, Mason Kendrick. I know enough, he replied simply. Over the next few days, as Judge Hartford conducted formal proceedings against Benjamin Thatcher, Helena found herself spending more and more time with Mason. He had planned to move on with the next cattle drive, but he kept finding reasons to stay in Ellsworth. He helped repair the schoolhouse roof that had been leaking. He escorted Helena through town when hostile glances from Thatcher's remaining supporters made her uncomfortable. He was simply there, solid and reliable in a way she had not experienced before. They took long walks in the evenings when the oppressive heat of the day had faded, talking about everything and nothing. Helena showed him the small schoolhouse where she taught, explaining her philosophy that education should help children think critically rather than simply memorize facts. That is why some folks were uncomfortable with you even before the Thatcher situation, Mason observed. You were teaching their children to question things. Is that so wrong? Helena asked. Should not education be about developing minds capable of independent thought? Not wrong at all, Mason assured her. Just dangerous to people who benefit from everyone accepting things as they are. She showed him the small room she rented above the general store, with its simple furnishings and the books she had carried all the way from Ohio. Mason examined the titles with interest, admitting that his own education had been limited, but that he had always loved stories. My uncle used to read to me when I was young, he said, picking up a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He said that words had power, that they could build worlds or tear them down. I never forgot that. Helena watched him handle the book with careful reverence despite his calloused hands. Your uncle sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, Mason agreed. He taught me that strength is not just about how hard you can hit or how well you can shoot. Real strength is standing for what is right even when it costs you something. Like standing up for a stranger accused of being crazy, Mason smiled, and Helena felt her heart skip. Exactly like that. The trial was brief. The evidence against Thatcher was overwhelming, and several homesteading families came forward to testify about the illnesses and deaths they had suffered after their wells turned bad. Dr. Morrison, who had been puzzled by the symptoms his patients exhibited, confirmed that they were consistent with arsenic poisoning. Thatcher was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, his assets seized to provide compensation to his victims. But the aftermath was complicated for Helena. While Judge Hartford had publicly vindicated her, many townspeople remained uncomfortable with the upheaval she had caused. The school board held a meeting to discuss her future as the teacher. Helena attended that meeting with Mason by her side. She stood before the 5 board members, all men who had initially been skeptical of hiring a woman teacher and now seemed to regret the decision. Miss Carver, said Harold Fleming, the chairman, no one disputes that you were correct about Mr. Thatcher's criminal activities. However, the board has concerns about whether you are the right fit for our community. Your methods are unconventional, and your actions have caused considerable disruption. My actions exposed a murderer, Helena said firmly. My methods teach children to think, If that makes me unsuitable, then perhaps this is not the right community for me. We have already received applications from 2 other teachers, both men with more traditional approaches, Fleming continued. Perhaps it would be best for everyone if you considered seeking a position elsewhere. Helena felt anger and hurt warring inside her. She had nearly died bringing the truth to light, and now she was being punished for it. Before she could respond, Mason spoke up. "Gentlemen, I have a question. How many of you have children in Miss Carver's school?" 3 of the 5 board members raised their hands somewhat reluctantly. "And have you noticed improvements in your children's abilities?" Mason continued. "Have they learned to read and write and calculate better than they did before?" "That is not the point," one of the other board members said. "It is exactly the point," Mason countered. "You are prepared to dismiss a teacher who is doing her job well because she made you uncomfortable, because she refused to stay silent about evil happening in your town. That says more about you than it does about her." There was a long, tense silence. Finally, Judge Hartford, who was sitting in on the meeting as an observer, cleared his throat. "If I may offer a perspective, Kansas territory is growing and changing. We need people who are willing to stand for what is right, not just what is comfortable. Miss Carver has demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and integrity that will help build a better future here. Dismissing her would be a grave mistake." The board members exchanged glances, and Helena could see the debate playing out on their faces. Finally, Fleming sighed. "Very well. Miss Carver, you may continue as our teacher, but we expect you to remember that discretion is sometimes the better part of valor." "I will remember that truth is more important than comfort," Helena replied evenly. As they left the meeting, Mason touched her elbow gently. "You are not making this easy on yourself." "I do not know how to be any other way," Helena admitted. "Perhaps I should be more accommodating, more willing to soften my words, but every time I consider it, I think of those children who died because no one would speak up." "I was not criticizing," Mason said quickly. "I was admiring. You have principles and you live by them. That is rare and precious." They had reached the edge of town where the prairie stretched out endlessly under the vast Kansas sky. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Helena stopped walking and turned to face Mason. "You have been in Ellsworth for over a week now. When are you planning to move on?" Mason looked uncomfortable. "There is a cattle drive forming up to head to Denver in a few days. I should probably sign on with them. The pay will be good, and I have been saving to buy my own land someday." "Your own land?" Helena felt her heart sink. She had been trying not to think about Mason leaving, but of course he would. He was a cowboy, a man who made his living on the trails. He had no reason to stay in Ellsworth. "Always figured I would settle down eventually," Mason said, studying the horizon rather than looking at her. "Find a piece of country that speaks to me and build something permanent. Getting tired of drifting from place to place with nothing to show for it but saddle sores and trail dust." "That sounds like a good dream," Helena managed to say. Now Mason did look at her, and the intensity in his steel-gray eyes made her breath catch. "Helena, I need to tell you something, and I am not good with words the way you are, so I am just going to say it plain. I have been making excuses to stay in Ellsworth, because every time I think about leaving, about not seeing you again, it feels wrong in a way I cannot quite explain. I have known you barely more than a week, but I have never met anyone like you. You are fierce and brilliant and braver than anyone I have ever known, and I think I am falling in love with you." Helena's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Mason, you do not have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I know I am just a cowboy with nothing to offer except a horse and whatever money I have saved. You are an educated woman with a profession and a future. I have no right to ask you for anything. but I could not leave without telling you how I feel." "You foolish man," Helena said, and then she was closing the distance between them, rising up on her toes to kiss him. Mason caught her waist, pulling her close as he returned the kiss with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Helena rested her forehead against his chest. "I have been falling in love with you too," she whispered. "From the moment you stood up in that crowd and said the crazy ones are often right, no one has ever believed in me the way you do." Mason's arms tightened around her. "So what do we do now? I do not want to leave you, but I need to earn a living. Ellsworth does not have work for someone with my skills." Helena pulled back to look up at him. "What if we found land near here? You could start a ranch, a small operation. I could continue teaching. It would be hard at first, but we would be together." "Are you suggesting we get married?" Mason asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I am suggesting we build a life together," Helena replied. "Whether we formalize it immediately or wait a bit does not matter to me. What matters is not being apart." Mason kissed her again, and this time there was promise in it, a future unfolding between them. "I have about $300 saved. It is not much, but it might be enough to claim a homestead and buy some starter cattle. Would you really be willing to take that risk with me?" "I have been taking risks my whole life," Helena said, smiling through the tears that were suddenly streaming down her face. "Taking one more with you seems like the best decision I could make." They sat down right there on the prairie grass, talking as the stars began to emerge overhead. They made plans the way people in love do, dreams built on hope and determination. Mason knew of some unclaimed land about 10 miles from Ellsworth, good grazing country with a creek running through it. He could build a house, start with maybe 20 head of cattle, and grow the operation slowly. Helena could ride into town each day to teach or perhaps eventually start a school closer to home if other families settled nearby. "It will not be easy," Mason warned. "Ranch life is brutal work, especially at the beginning. Long days, hard labor, uncertainty about weather and markets." "I am not afraid of hard work," Helena replied, "and I would rather face difficulties with you than have comfort without you." They returned to town late that evening, and Mason walked Helena to her door above the general store. "I am going to talk to the land office tomorrow," he said. "Start the process of filing a claim. If you are serious about this, we should make it official." "I am serious," Helena assured him. "More serious than I have ever been about anything." Mason kissed her one more time, gentle and sweet. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start building our future." Helena floated through the next day in a daze of happiness. She taught her students, but her mind kept drifting to Mason and the life they were planning. When the school day ended, she found him waiting outside, his face troubled. "There is a problem," he said without preamble. "The land I was thinking of, someone filed a claim on it this morning. Beat me to the land office by about an hour." Helena's heart sank. "Is there other land available? Not near Ellsworth that is worth having," Mason admitted. "Most of the good claims were taken months or years ago." "There is land available further west, but it is rougher country, less water, harder to work." They walked through town, both struggling with this setback. Helena refused to give up hope. "There has to be something. We just need to think creatively." As they passed the Grand Central Hotel, Judge Hartford hailed them from the porch. "Miss Carver, Mr. Kendrick, a moment of your time, please." They joined him, and the judge gestured for them to sit. "I have been making inquiries about you both," he said without preamble. "I hope you do not mind, but I have become invested in seeing you succeed after the courage you both showed during the Thatcher affair." "What kind of inquiries?" Helena asked cautiously. "I learned that you are looking to establish a homestead, Mr. Kendrick. I also learned that all the good claims near Ellsworth are already filed, so I have a proposition for you both." Hartford pulled out a document and spread it on the table. I own 300 acres about 8 miles south of here. Good land with water rights and a small cabin already built. I purchased it years ago thinking I might retire there, but my work as a circuit judge keeps me too busy. I would like to sell it to you at cost, with payment terms you can manage. Mason studied the document carefully. Your Honor, this land is worth far more than what you are asking. Why would you do this? Hartford smiled. Because I believe in investing in people of character. You both stood up when others would not. Miss Carver exposed corruption at great personal risk, and you defended her when no one else would. The West needs more people like you. Consider this my contribution to ensuring you can build the life you deserve. Helena felt tears threatening again. We do not know how to thank you. Build a good life, Hartford said simply. Raise strong children if you are so blessed. Be the kind of neighbors who make a community better. That will be thanks enough. Mason and Helena looked at each other, and Helena saw her own overwhelming gratitude reflected in his eyes. We accept, Mason said, extending his hand to the judge, and we will make you proud of this decision. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and planning. Mason and Helena were married by Judge Hartford in a simple ceremony at the small church in Ellsworth. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire service, and even Sheriff Donovan showed up to offer his congratulations. Helena wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, and Mason wore his best clothes, which were still trail-worn but clean and presentable. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed Helena with a tenderness that made her forget there were other people present. Mrs. Kendrick, he murmured against her lips, and she laughed with pure joy. They moved to the property immediately. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was solidly built and could be expanded. Mason threw himself into the work of establishing the ranch with a single-minded determination that Helena found both inspiring and occasionally frustrating. You need to rest sometimes, she told him one evening as he came in from mending fence lines, so exhausted he could barely stand. Rest when it is done, he replied, but he let her guide him to a chair and began removing his boots. We only have a few months before winter. Need to get everything ready. Helena knelt before him, taking over the task of unlacing his boots. You will be no good to this ranch or to me if you work yourself to death. We are building a life together, Mason. That means you need to take care of yourself so we can enjoy it. He cupped her face in his calloused hands. How did I get so lucky to find you? I think luck had nothing to do with it, Helena replied softly. I think we found each other because we were both brave enough to stand for what was right even when it was hard. That kind of courage attracts its own rewards. They settled into a rhythm over the following months. Helena rode into Ellsworth 3 days a week to teach, while Mason worked the ranch. On the days she did not teach, Helena helped with the livestock and began cultivating a garden. Mason purchased 20 head of cattle using part of his savings and borrowed money from Judge Hartford, betting their future on being able to build the herd. It was grueling work, but there was a satisfaction in it that Helena had never experienced before. When she went to sleep at night in Mason's arms, exhausted and often sore, she felt a completeness that had eluded her entire life. They were building something together, something that was entirely theirs. As winter approached, they faced new challenges. Mason needed to ensure they had enough hay put up for the cattle, while Helena worked to winterize the cabin and preserve food for the months when fresh provisions would be scarce. They worked side by side, and Helena discovered strengths she had not known she possessed. She learned to handle cattle, to mend tack, to shoot a rifle well enough to bring down a deer when they needed meat. One evening in late October, as they sat before the fire after supper, Mason pulled Helena close and kissed the top of her head. "I never imagined being this happy," he admitted. "Some days I still cannot quite believe this is real, that you are my wife and we are building this life together." "I feel the same way," Helena said, snuggling deeper into his embrace. "There are moments when I am teaching in town, and I remember how close I came to losing everything, how close I came to never knowing you. It makes me appreciate every single day we have." "Do you ever regret speaking up?" Mason asked quietly. "If you had stayed silent about Thatcher, you would not have been in danger. Things would have been easier." Helena twisted to look up at him. "If I had stayed silent, those wells would still be poisoned, more families would have suffered, and I would have had to live with knowing I did nothing." "No, I do not regret it. The only thing I regret is that I could not do more sooner." Mason's eyes were warm with love and pride. "You are an extraordinary woman, Helena Kendrick. And you are an extraordinary man who saw past everyone's certainty that I was crazy to recognize truth when you heard it," Helena replied. "We make a good team." "We do," Mason agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I have been thinking. Once we get the ranch more established, once we have a bit more security, I would like to start a family. If that is something you want as well." Helena felt warmth spread through her chest. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but this felt more real, more immediate. "I want that very much. I want to raise children who are brave and honest, who stand up for what is right even when it is difficult. Children who have their mother's intelligence and courage," Mason said, "and their father's strength and integrity," Helena added. They sealed the promise with a kiss that quickly deepened into passion. Mason lifted Helena into his arms and carried her to their bedroom, and they made love with the tenderness and intensity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Winter in Kansas was harsh that year. Bitter cold swept down from the north, and snow fell in quantities that made travel to Ellsworth impossible for days at a time. Helena found herself trapped in the cabin with Mason while they both worried about the cattle. Mason bundled up and went out multiple times each day to break ice on the water sources and ensure the herd had access to the hay he had stored. Helena kept the cabin warm and prepared hot meals for when Mason came in half frozen from his work. She read aloud to him in the evenings, stories from her books that transported them both away from the grinding difficulty of winter survival. On the worst nights, when the wind howled around the cabin and temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, they lay together under every blanket they owned and talked about the future they were building. "Spring will come," Mason assured her during one particularly brutal stretch when they had been snowed in for a week. "It always does. And when it does, we will see how the herd weathered the winter. If we did well, we can expand, maybe add some horses. I have always wanted to try my hand at breeding good working horses." "Tell me about the horses you have known," Helena said, burrowing against his warmth. "The ones that stood out in your memory." Mason began describing the various horses he had worked with over the years, and Helena drifted to sleep listening to his deep voice, feeling safer than she had ever felt in her life despite the storm raging outside. They lost 4 cattle to the winter, which Mason said was better than expected given the severity of the weather. When spring finally arrived in March of 1873, they emerged from their isolation to find a world transformed. The prairie came alive with wildflowers, and the creek that ran through their property swelled with snowmelt. Helena discovered she was pregnant in April. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When Dr. Morrison in Ellsworth confirmed it, she rode home with her heart singing despite the morning sickness that made the journey uncomfortable. Mason was mending a section of corral when she arrived. He looked up and knew immediately from her expression that something significant had happened. He dropped his tools and strode over to help her dismount. "What is it? Are you all right?" The concern in his voice made her smile. "I am fine. Better than fine." Helena took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "Mason, we are going to have a baby." For a moment, he just stared at her, processing the information. Then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around before carefully setting her back down. "A baby. We are having a baby." He kissed her soundly, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father speaking. I promise to do everything I can to give you a good life." Helena ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed with emotion. "We are going to be parents." "The best parents," Mason said fiercely, looking up at her. "Our child is going to know they are loved every single day of their life. They are going to grow up free to think and question, and become whoever they are meant to be." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Helena continued teaching through May, but decided to take the next school year off to focus on the baby. The school board, perhaps still feeling guilty about how they had treated her after the Thatcher affair, assured her that her position would be waiting when she was ready to return. Mason became incredibly protective, insisting Helena not overwork herself and taking on tasks she had previously handled. She found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, having to remind him that she was pregnant, not fragile. "I just want to take care of you," he said when she protested about his hovering. "You do take care of me," Helena assured him, "but I am still capable of feeding chickens and tending the garden. I will let you know if I need to slow down." They worked together to prepare for the baby's arrival. Mason built a beautiful cradle from oak wood, carefully sanding and finishing it until it was smooth as silk. Helena sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of anticipation. Mrs. Patterson visited regularly, bringing advice and supplies and fussing over Helena like the grandmother she had never had. Judge Hartford stopped by one afternoon in August, bringing a leather-bound journal as a gift. "For recording the child's milestones," he explained. "I have found that memories fade more quickly than we would like. Writing things down helps preserve them." "Thank you, Your Honor," Helena said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "You have been so good to us." "You have proven my faith in you justified," Hartford replied, looking around the growing ranch with satisfaction. "You are building something solid here, something that will last." Helena gave birth to a son on a cold November morning in 1873. The labor was long and difficult, with Dr. Morrison summoned from Ellsworth and Mrs. Patterson serving as midwife. Mason paced outside the bedroom, helpless and terrified, until Mrs. Patterson finally called him in. "Come meet your son," she said with a tired smile. Mason entered to find Helena exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the small red face of his child. "He is perfect," Mason whispered. "He is ours," Helena said softly. She lifted the baby toward Mason. "Hold your son." With trembling hands, Mason took the infant, cradling him against his chest with surprising gentleness for a man who worked with his hands all day. "Hello, little man," he murmured. "Welcome to the world. We have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas after Mason's uncle who had raised him. Thomas Mason Kendrick, a name that honored the past while looking toward the future. The baby was healthy and strong, with his father's dark hair and what looked like it might be his mother's green eyes, though it was too early to be certain. Those first months of Thomas's life were exhausting but joyful. Helena had thought she understood love before, but nothing had prepared her for the fierce protectiveness and overwhelming tenderness she felt for her son. Mason was a devoted father, coming in from work throughout the day to check on the baby and spending his evenings cradling Thomas while Helena rested. "You are going to spoil him," Helena teased one evening, watching Mason rock their son to sleep. "Impossible to spoil a baby with love," Mason replied, not taking his eyes off Thomas's face. "He will have plenty of time to learn about hard work and responsibility. Right now, he just needs to know he is cherished." As winter settled in again, they adjusted to their new reality as parents. Thomas was a good baby, generally sleeping well and eating enthusiastically. Helena marveled at how their lives had changed in just over a year. 12 months earlier, she had been alone in Ellsworth, fighting battles no one wanted her to fight. Now she had a husband she loved deeply and a son who made her heart overflow. The ranch continued to grow slowly but steadily. Mason's careful management and hard work were paying off. The herd had grown to 30 head through natural increase and careful purchases. He had also acquired 2 horses, the beginning of the breeding program he dreamed about. Money was tight, but they were making progress. One evening in early spring of 1874, as they sat together watching Thomas play with a wooden toy Mason had carved, Helena brought up something that had been on her mind. "I have been thinking about going back to teaching next fall," she said carefully, watching Mason's reaction. "Thomas will be almost a year old and I miss the work. Mrs. Patterson has offered to watch him during the days I am in town." Mason looked thoughtful. "If that is what you want, I support it. I know teaching is important to you, but I will miss having you here every day." "I will miss being here," Helena admitted. "But I think I can do both, be a mother and a teacher. Women have been managing multiple roles since the beginning of time." "You can manage anything you set your mind to," Mason said, reaching over to take her hand. "That is one of the things I love most about you, your determination to be fully yourself, not just what others expect you to be." Helena squeezed his hand gratefully. "I am lucky to have a husband who understands that." "I am the lucky one," Mason countered. "I found a woman who is my partner in every sense of the word, who challenges me and supports me and makes me want to be better than I am." They sealed the sentiment with a kiss, while Thomas babbled happily at their feet, playing in a patch of sunlight streaming through the window. Helena did return to teaching that fall, and she found that she had been right about being able to manage both roles. It required careful organization and occasionally left her exhausted, but the satisfaction of doing work she loved while also raising her son made it worthwhile. Mason adjusted his schedule to be more present during the days Helena was teaching, and they made it work through teamwork and communication. The years that followed were marked by steady progress and growing happiness. The ranch expanded gradually. Thomas grew into a bright, curious child who loved accompanying his father to check on the cattle and helping his mother in the garden. He started attending the school where Helena taught when he turned 5, and she experienced the unique joy and challenge of having her own child in her classroom. In the spring of 1876, Helena gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Helena's mother. Sarah was different from Thomas from the beginning, quieter and more observant, with Mason's steel gray eyes and a serious expression that made her seem wise beyond her years. Mason was utterly smitten with his daughter. Helena often found him simply holding Sarah and staring at her in wonder. "I did not know it was possible to love someone this much," he told Helena one night. "Between you and Thomas and now Sarah, my heart feels like it might burst sometimes." "I know exactly what you mean," Helena replied, watching him rock their daughter. "We have built something beautiful here, Mason. Not just the ranch, but this family, this life we have created together." Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. There were challenges, of course. Droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that required every ounce of strength they possessed, market fluctuations that made money tight. But through it all, Mason and Helena faced everything together, their partnership strengthened by each obstacle they overcame. Thomas grew into a capable young man who loved ranch life as much as his father did. He had inherited Mason's natural way with animals and Helena's quick mind. Sarah, meanwhile, showed early signs of having her mother's passion for learning and her father's steady determination. Both children were taught to question, to think critically, and to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. One evening in 1881, when Thomas was 8 and Sarah was 5, the family sat together after supper while Helena read aloud from one of her books. When she finished the chapter, Thomas looked up with a question in his eyes. "Mama, is it true that people used to think you were crazy?" Helena glanced at Mason, who gave her an encouraging nod. She had known this conversation would come eventually. "Yes, it is true. When I first came to Ellsworth before you were born, I discovered something bad happening in the town. A man was poisoning water to steal land from families. When I told people about it, many of them did not believe me. They thought I was crazy or lying." "But you were telling the truth," Thomas said, his young face serious. "I was," Helena confirmed. "And sometimes telling the truth makes people uncomfortable, especially if it is a truth they do not want to hear." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What happened then?" "Your father stood up for me," Helena said, smiling at Mason. "When no one else believed me, he said something I have never forgotten. He said that the crazy ones are often right. He believed me when I needed someone to believe me most." Mason picked up the story. "Your mother was the bravest person I had ever met. She stood alone against people who wanted to silence her because she knew the truth needed to be told. That is real courage, not the absence of fear, but doing what is right even when you are afraid." "Is that why you tell us to always speak up when we see something wrong?" Thomas asked. "Exactly," Helena said. "Your father and I want you to grow up knowing that your voice matters, that standing for what is right is always worth it, even when it is hard." Both children nodded solemnly, and Helena felt a wave of gratitude for these extraordinary young people she and Mason were raising. They were teaching their children the lessons they had learned through hard experience, hoping to give them the tools to navigate a world that was still rough and often unfair. By 1885, the ranch had become a true success. Mason's hard work and careful management had built the operation from 20 cattle to over 200 head. The horse breeding program was also thriving, with Mason developing a reputation for producing excellent working horses that were in high demand throughout Kansas. They had expanded the original cabin into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and even a small library where Helena kept her growing collection of books. Helena had become one of the most respected teachers in the region. Her methods were no longer considered controversial. Instead, other teachers came to observe her classroom and learn her techniques. She had proven that children who were taught to think critically became more engaged learners and more capable adults. Thomas, now 12 years old, worked the ranch alongside his father with a competence that made both parents proud. He had his own horse, a beautiful mare named Willow that he had helped birth and train. Sarah, at 9, showed a particular aptitude for mathematics and science, subjects that Helena nurtured with additional lessons and books ordered from back east. One warm summer evening, Mason and Helena sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and red. The children were inside doing their evening chores, and for a moment, it was just the two of them. "You remember the first time we sat together and watched the sunset?" Mason asked, his arm around Helena's shoulders. On the prairie outside Ellsworth, the day after you stood up for me in front of the whole town, Helena recalled. You told me you were falling in love with me. Best decision I ever made telling you that, Mason said. Some men would have kept silent, afraid of rejection. But I figured if you were brave enough to stand alone against the whole town, I could be brave enough to tell you how I felt. Helena leaned her head against his shoulder. I think about that day often, about how close we both came to never finding each other. If you had ridden on with the next cattle drive, if I had not stood up to Thatcher, our whole lives would be different. But we did not miss each other, Mason pointed out. We were both brave enough to do hard things, and that brought us together. Everything we have built, this entire life, it started because we were both willing to stand for what was right even when it cost us something. The crazy ones are often right, Helena quoted softly, smiling. They are, Mason agreed, and I was right about you. Right that you were someone extraordinary. Right that loving you would be the best thing I ever did. Helena tilted her face up for a kiss, and Mason obliged her with the same tenderness he had shown on that first kiss over a dozen years earlier. When they pulled apart, she saw the same love in his eyes that had been there from the beginning, perhaps even deeper now after years of building a life together. I have never regretted a single moment, Helena said quietly. Not the fear, not the danger, not the hard work. It was all worth it to have this life with you. Same here, Mason replied. Every trail I rode, every difficult season, every challenge we faced, it was all preparing me for this. For you, for our family and this life we have created. They sat together as the stars began to emerge, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of knowing someone deeply. Inside, they could hear Thomas and Sarah laughing about something, the sound drifting through the open windows. We did well, Helena observed. Our children are growing up strong and confident and kind. They know how to work hard, but they also know how to think. They are not afraid to question or to stand up for themselves. They learned from their mother, Mason said. You showed them what courage looks like. And they learned from their father, Helena countered. You showed them what integrity and dedication look like, what it means to build something lasting through honest work. As summer turned to fall, the ranch prepared for another winter. But this year felt different, more secure than any previous year. They had built something solid, something that would last beyond their own lives. The children were thriving, the ranch was prospering, and Mason and Helena's love had only deepened with time. In October of 1885, Judge Hartford passed away peacefully in his sleep. Mason and Helena traveled to Ellsworth for the funeral, bringing the children to pay their respects to the man who had made so much of their life possible. As they stood by his grave, Helena reflected on how one person's kindness and belief in doing right could ripple outward, changing lives in ways that person might never fully know. He gave us our chance, Mason said quietly as they walked back to their wagon. Sold us that land when he could have gotten far more money from someone else. Believed in us when we were just starting out. He told us to build a good life and raise strong children, Helena remembered. We kept our promise to him. That winter, they gathered as a family to record stories and memories in the journal Judge Hartford had given them when Thomas was born. Helena wrote about the early days in Ellsworth, about being tied to a post in the street and the cowboy who had stood up for her. Mason added his own memories, describing how he had known from the first moment he heard Helena speak that she was telling the truth, and how he could not walk away from someone with that much courage. Thomas and Sarah listened raptly to these stories they had heard before, but never tired of hearing again. They were learning their own family history, understanding the foundation of courage and integrity upon which their lives had been built. Will people ever not believe us when we tell the truth? Sarah asked, her serious gray eyes fixed on her mother. Perhaps, Helena said honestly. The world is full of people who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, but that does not mean you should ever stop speaking truth. Your voice matters, and sometimes one person speaking up can change everything. Like you changed everything, Thomas said. Like we all change everything when we choose to be brave, Helena corrected gently. Your father changed things by believing me. Judge Hartford changed things by helping us. Mrs. Patterson changed things by showing kindness when others showed hostility. We all have power to make the world better, but we have to be willing to use it even when it is frightening. As the years continued to pass, the Kendrick Ranch became known throughout Kansas not just for its quality cattle and horses, but for the family that ran it. People spoke of Mason Kendrick's fairness and integrity, of Helena Kendrick's wisdom and courage, of the children who were being raised to value hard work and honest dealing. In 1888, when Sarah was 12 and Thomas was 15, a situation arose that tested everything Mason and Helena had taught their children. A neighboring rancher named Victor Sullivan began encroaching on Kendrick land, moving his fence line gradually to take over a water source that belonged to Mason. It was a classic range dispute, the kind that sometimes turned violent in the West. Mason confronted Sullivan about it, trying to resolve the matter peacefully. But Sullivan, who had a reputation as a bully, laughed in his face. "Prove the water rights are yours, Kendrick. Otherwise, possession is what matters, and I possess it now." Mason returned home frustrated and angry. Helena listened as he explained the situation, then offered her perspective. "We have the original land deed from Judge Hartford. It clearly shows that water source is on our property. We need to take this to the proper authorities rather than trying to handle it ourselves." "That could take months," Mason protested. "In the meantime, Sullivan will be using our water and my cattle will suffer." "Better that than starting a war that could get someone killed," Helena said firmly. "We have built our life on doing things the right way, on standing for what is right through proper channels. This is no different than when I exposed Thatcher. We use truth and the law, not violence and intimidation." Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "But Papa, he is stealing from us. Should we not stand up for ourselves?" "We are standing up for ourselves," Mason said, his anger cooling as he considered Helena's words. "We are just doing it the right way. Your mother is correct. We go to the county sheriff and the land office with our documentation. We prove our case through facts, not force." "But what if he does not listen?" Sarah asked, joining her brother. "What if he keeps stealing even after you prove it is wrong?" Helena smiled at her daughter. "That is when we trust that justice will prevail. It may take time and it may be frustrating, but in the end, truth wins out. It has to, or we are no better than the people who try to silence truth with power and intimidation." The family went together to the county seat, presenting their case to the sheriff and land office officials. The documentation was clear, and within 2 weeks, Sullivan was ordered to move his fence back to its proper location and compensate Mason for the water his cattle had used. Sullivan complied angrily, but he complied. "You see," Helena told the children afterward, "sometimes doing the right thing requires patience and faith that the system will work. It is not always fast, and it is not always satisfying in the moment. But it is the only way to build a society based on law and justice, rather than whoever has the most power." Thomas and Sarah absorbed the lesson, adding it to the foundation of values their parents had been building in them since birth. They saw firsthand that their mother's way of confronting injustice through courage and truth, and their father's way of standing firmly for what was right while following proper processes, could work together to create real change. By 1890, Thomas was 17 and beginning to think about his own future. He loved the ranch and wanted to continue working it with his father, but he also had dreams of expanding into new areas. One evening at dinner, he broached the subject. "Papa, what would you think about me spending next year learning more about modern ranching techniques? There is a program in Denver that teaches scientific approaches to cattle breeding and range management. I think it could help us grow the operation." Mason was quiet for a moment, and Helena could see him processing the idea. Their son wanting to leave, even temporarily, was difficult, but she also saw pride in her husband's eyes. "That sounds like a smart idea," Mason said finally. "The ranching business is changing. The old ways will not sustain operations in the future. If you can learn new methods and bring that knowledge back here, we could do something special, build something even better than what we have now." "You are not angry?" Thomas asked, clearly surprised. "Why would I be angry?" Mason replied. "You are doing exactly what your mother and I taught you to do. You are thinking ahead, planning for the future, willing to work hard to achieve your goals. I am proud of you, son." Sarah, now 14, looked thoughtful. "I have been thinking about becoming a teacher like Mama." "Is that something I could do?" Helena felt her heart swell. "Of course you can. If that is what you want, we will find a way to make it happen. You have the mind and the heart for it." "But I do not want to leave the ranch permanently," Sarah added quickly. "I love it here. I just want to be able to do both like you do, Mama." "There is no reason you cannot," Helena assured her. "Women can have lives that include multiple things. You can be a rancher and a teacher, a wife and an individual, a mother and a person with her own dreams. Never let anyone tell you that you have to choose only one thing to be." Mason reached across the table to take Helena's hand. "Your mother taught me that from the very beginning. She refused to be just one thing, and she made me better for it. Both of you should build lives that are as full and rich as you can make them." As the evening wore on, they talked about futures and possibilities, about dreams and plans. Helena looked around the table at her family and felt profound gratitude. They had come so far from that day in 1872, when she had been tied to a post in the street, accused of being crazy for speaking truth. That night, as she and Mason prepared for bed, Helena stood at the window looking out over the ranch they had built together. Mason came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "Everything," Helena replied. "How much our lives have changed since that day you stood up for me in Ellsworth. How we have built all of this from nothing but determination and love. How our children are growing into exactly the kind of people we hoped they would be." "We did well," Mason agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible when I was just a cowboy riding cattle trails and sleeping under the stars." Helena turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever miss it, that life of freedom and movement?" "Not even for a second," Mason said firmly. "That life had its moments, but it was empty compared to this. Compared to you and our children and this home we have created. I found something on those trails that I had been looking for without knowing it. I found purpose. I found a reason to stop drifting and put down roots. I found you." They kissed with the ease and passion of a couple who had loved each other through years of challenges and triumphs. When they finally climbed into bed, Helena curled against Mason's side in the position that had become second nature over the years. "I love you," she murmured, already half asleep. "I love you too," Mason replied, his arms tightening around her. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Helena Kendrick." The years continued to roll forward, bringing change and growth. Thomas did go to Denver for his training, returning a year later with new knowledge that he immediately began implementing on the ranch. The operation grew larger and more efficient under the combined efforts of father and son working together. Sarah pursued her teaching certification while still helping on the ranch. She had her mother's gift for connecting with students and her father's patience. When she began teaching at the Ellsworth School at age 19, she continued the tradition Helena had started of teaching children to think critically and question respectfully. In 1895, when Helena was 45 and Mason was nearly 50, they celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner at home. Their children had arranged everything, cooking the meal and decorating the house with wildflowers from the prairie. After dinner, Thomas stood and raised his glass. "To my parents, who taught us that courage is not just about facing physical danger, but about standing for what is right even when the whole world seems against you. You have shown us what love looks like when it is built on mutual respect and partnership. Thank you for giving us a foundation we can build our own lives on." Sarah added her own toast. "To Mama and Papa, who never told us we could not do something because of who we were or where we came from. You taught us to believe in ourselves and to believe in truth. Everything good in my life comes from the example you set." Helena found herself crying, overwhelmed by the love in the room. Mason squeezed her hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Later, when the children had cleaned up and gone to bed, Mason and Helena walked out to the porch to watch the stars emerge. It was a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, these quiet moments of connection at the end of busy days. "Do you remember what you said to me the first time I told you I loved you?" Mason asked, his arm around Helena's shoulders. "I called you a foolish man," Helena recalled, laughing softly. "Then I kissed you." "Best kiss of my life up to that point," Mason said. "Though I have to say, 23 years of kisses have made it hard to rank them. They just keep getting better." "Sweet talker," Helena teased, but she was pleased. "You know what I remember most clearly from those early days? The moment you said the crazy ones are often right." No one had ever validated my perception that way before. Everyone else was so certain I was wrong or lying or disturbed, but you heard the truth in what I was saying. "You made it easy to believe you," Mason replied. "There was such conviction in your voice, such certainty." And I had learned over the years to trust my instincts about people. My instincts told me you were someone special, someone worth believing in. "Those instincts served you well," Helena observed. "You got stuck with me for life." "Best thing that ever happened to me," Mason said seriously. "I mean that, Helena. Every good thing in my life traces back to the day I decided to speak up for you. Our marriage, our children, this ranch, the sense of purpose and meaning I have. All of it started because I was brave enough to stand with you when you needed someone." Helena turned to look at her husband in the starlight. He was graying now, lines of age and hard work marking his face. But to her, he was as handsome as the day they met. More so, perhaps, because she knew him so deeply now. Knew his kindness and strength, his integrity and devotion. "We have had a good life," she said softly. "Better than either of us had any right to expect." "We have had a great life," Mason corrected. "And it is not over yet. We still have years ahead of us. More time to watch our children build their own lives. Maybe grandchildren someday. More sunsets and conversations and moments like this." "I look forward to all of it," Helena said, leaning into his embrace. "As long as I have you beside me, I can face whatever comes." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The crazy one who had spoken truth when no one wanted to hear it, and the cowboy who had been wise enough to listen. Together, they had created a legacy of courage and integrity that would outlive them both. As the years moved into the new century, the Kendrick Ranch continued to thrive. Thomas married a smart young woman named Rebecca who fit seamlessly into the family, and they gave Mason and Helena their first grandchild in 1901, a boy they named Mason after his grandfather. Sarah married a teacher from a neighboring town, and together they opened a school that served several small communities in the region. Mason and Helena gradually stepped back from the day-to-day operation of the ranch, trusting Thomas and Rebecca to take over while they enjoyed a more leisurely pace. They traveled a bit, visiting places they had only read about in books. But they always returned to their Kansas ranch, to the land they had built their life on. In 1910, when Helena was 60 and Mason was 65, they attended the dedication of a new school building in Ellsworth. The town had grown significantly over the years, and a larger facility was needed. At the ceremony, the mayor announced that the school would be named the Kendrick Academy, honoring both Helena's maiden name and the family name she had taken through marriage. Helena Carver came to Ellsworth in 1872 as a young teacher with progressive ideas and unwavering courage, the mayor said to the assembled crowd. She exposed corruption at great personal risk, and in doing so, she changed this town for the better. Mason Kendrick stood with her when others would not, demonstrating that true strength is found in standing for what is right. Together, they have been an example to this community for nearly 40 years. It is fitting that the children of Ellsworth will be educated in a building that bears their name. Helena and Mason stood together as the crowd applauded, both moved beyond words. They had never sought recognition for what they did. They had simply tried to live according to their principles and raise their children to do the same. But this acknowledgement meant something, a recognition that speaking truth and standing for justice mattered. Afterward, an elderly woman approached them. She was thin and gray-haired, but her eyes were bright with gratitude. "Mrs. Kendrick, you probably do not remember me, but my name is Martha Henderson. My son Tommy was the boy you saved from Mr. Thatcher's warehouse all those years ago. He is a grown man now with children of his own. I have always wanted to thank you for your courage. If you had not spoken up, if you had not persisted even when everyone called you crazy, my family might have been one of those who died from the poisoned water. You saved us." Helena took the woman's hands, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for telling me. I have often wondered about the families who were spared because Thatcher was stopped." "You changed everything," Martha said simply. "Never doubt that what you did mattered. It mattered more than you will ever know." As they drove home that evening, Helena and Mason were both quiet, processing the emotions of the day. Finally, Mason spoke. "You know what strikes me? We were so young when all that happened. 22 and 25, barely adults ourselves. Yet we made decisions that shaped not just our own lives but the lives of countless others." "We were young," Helena agreed, "but we were also old enough to know right from wrong and brave enough to act on that knowledge. Age does not determine courage or wisdom, character does." "I am grateful I found someone with your character," Mason said. "These 40-plus years with you have been the greatest gift of my life." Helena reached across the wagon seat to take his hand. "The feeling is entirely mutual, my love." They spent their later years in contentment, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the ranch continue to grow under Thomas's capable leadership. They told stories to their grandchildren about the old days, about a time when Kansas territory was still wild, and towns like Ellsworth were rough frontier settlements. The grandchildren loved hearing about the day their grandmother was accused of being crazy, and their grandfather stood up for her. They would beg for the story over and over, never tiring of hearing how truth and courage had triumphed over lies and corruption. "The crazy ones are often right," Mason would tell them. repeating the words that had become something of a family motto. Remember that when you are tempted to stay silent because speaking up is hard. Remember that one person with courage can change everything. In 1920, Mason Kendrick passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75. He had lived a full life, surrounded by love, having built something lasting through honest work and integrity. Helena was devastated by the loss, having spent nearly 50 years with the man who had believed in her when no one else would. But she carried on, supported by her children and grandchildren, finding purpose in sharing the lessons she and Mason had learned. She lived another 8 years, dying in 1928 at the age of 78. Her final words were reportedly about Mason, telling her children that she was ready to be with him again. At her funeral, the church in Ellsworth was packed with people whose lives she had touched. Former students, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, spoke about how she had taught them to think and question and stand up for what was right. Neighbors talked about the example she and Mason had set, about the integrity with which they had lived their lives. Sarah, now 52 years old and a respected educator in her own right, delivered the eulogy. "My mother taught me that courage is not about being unafraid. It is about doing what is right even when you are terrified. She taught me that one person speaking truth can change the world, even when that truth is unpopular. Most importantly, she taught me through her example that love built on mutual respect and partnership can sustain you through any challenge. She and my father showed me what it means to build a life of purpose and meaning." The Kendrick Ranch continued for generations, passed down through the family with each generation adding their own improvements while maintaining the core values Mason and Helena had established. The story of the crazy woman who spoke truth and the cowboy who believed her became part of family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The Carver-Kendrick Academy in Ellsworth continued to educate children using the progressive methods Helena had pioneered. A plaque in the entrance hall told the story of the school's namesakes, ensuring that new generations of students understood the courage and integrity that had founded their institution. In the end, Helena Carver and Mason Kendrick had built more than just a successful ranch. They had built a legacy of courage, of speaking truth to power, of standing for what is right even when the cost is high. They had shown that one person's bravery can inspire others, that love built on respect and partnership can endure any challenge, and that the crazy ones who see truth others refuse to acknowledge are often the ones who change the world for the better. Their story became woven into the fabric of Kansas history, a reminder that the American West was built not just by gunslingers and outlaws, but by ordinary people who did extraordinary things because their character demanded it. A schoolteacher who would not stay silent about injustice. A cowboy who was wise enough to listen when everyone else dismissed her as crazy. Together, they had made a difference that echoed through generations. And in quiet moments, when their descendants gathered on the ranch they had built, someone would inevitably repeat the words that had started it all. The crazy ones are often right. It was a reminder to keep speaking truth, to keep standing for justice, to keep believing that courage and integrity matter, because Helena and Mason had proven that they do. They had proven that two people with courage can change everything if only they are brave enough to try.